first time the parchment was unsealed, its surface crackled like skin baked too long beneath a cruel sun. Those present swore they smelled tallow and rot in the air, though no candles had been lit in the scriptorium for days. The confession of Brother Elias, inked in a hand both trembling and deliberate, was said to be too long for any sane man to have written in one sitting. His words bled across sheaves of lambskin as though forced from a body more corpse than living. Those who read it would not speak openly of what it contained, but in whispers in the cloisters and cellars of Yorkshire abbeys, they called it a scripture of shadows, a record of something that had no place in Christendom, nor in the heart of any man. It was found buried beneath a flagstone at the ruined priory of Kirkstead, in a chamber so narrow and airless that the men who uncovered it fainted before the last stone was pried away. The chamber itself bore no altar, no relic, no cross, only a stool carved crudely from blackened oak, and the journal bound with sinew, stained with a brownness that was not entirely ink. To open it was to trespass. Yet open it they did, and the first lines carried the weight of a man who had already damned himself. I, Elias, brother of no house and servant of no true Lord, commit these words so that my torment may be a warning. I have seen with my own eyes the fruit of devotion twisted into hunger. Let it be known, though, that what I record is no vision of demons, no tale of fire and horn. It is colder, quieter, and far nearer to the marrow of men. There were those who insisted the manuscript had been a fraud, composed centuries later to blacken the memory of the old priory. Yet the ink tested older than any forgery should have been. The parchment bore the cut marks of knives used in the mid-18th century, and faint impressions of a quill sharpened in haste, breaking again and again as though the writer's hand shook without cease. Stranger still were the stains, tested long after by modern hands, that revealed traces of iron and salt, elements more at home in blood than in dye. What made Brother Elias' confession endure in the imagination was not merely the grotesque nature of his words, but the silence in the official record. The priory at Kirkstead, once a minor house attached to a larger Cistercian order, had been abandoned in the mid-1740s. No decree of dissolution, no plague, no fire, no war is recorded as its undoing. One winter it sang its hymns, and by the next spring it was a carcass of stone, its gardens overgrown, its windows bare to the elements. Brothers themselves were never accounted for. They did not scatter to other houses, nor were their names recorded in burials. It was as if they had been drawn back into the earth. Parchment, therefore, became both explanation and riddle. For Elias did not speak of his brethren as if they had died, nor as if they had fled. He spoke of a hunger shared, cultivated, and sanctified. He wrote of nights when silence was broken not by prayer, but by the soft shuffle of bare feet in the dark, moving toward something unspoken. He wrote of faces lit only by moonlight, slack with a devotion too profound to name. And he wrote, above all, of the thing that came to dwell among them, not from without but from within, called forth by their own hands. Elias never named it. Instead he circled its presence with metaphors of stone and frost, with descriptions of corridors that grew longer in the night than by day, of voices that spoke in familiar tones yet urged unfamiliar acts. He spoke of the sound of breath when none were near, of the taste of ash that clung to bread consecrated at the altar. His brethren, he wrote, became unlike themselves, though their faces and hands betrayed no change. Their eyes lingered too long, their lips moved when no psalm was sung, and their sleep was disturbed by motions beneath the coverlets, as though bodies learned gestures forbidden in the waking world. The most terrible passage in the opening leaves is one scholar's debate to this day. Elias described the priory's refectory in winter. He claimed the hearth went cold though fires were kept stoked without pause. The stone of the floor grew slick, as if dew had formed within, and the smell, not of smoke, but of a slaughterhouse at dawn, copper and wet. Brothers ate their stew in silence, spoons moving slow, and when he looked into their bowls, broth was black as tar though he had tasted it only a moment before and found it of lentils and barley. They ate without complaint, and when Elias forced himself to look again, his own bowl was filled with the same black substance. He lifted the spoon, and it trembled in his hand, yet he swallowed. He wrote that it was cold, slick, and without taste, yet it filled him until he wept. None at the table spoke of what they had consumed, but none rose in disgust. They continued night after night, as though a new sacrament had been introduced, one darker than wine, more binding than bread. From this beginning, confession widens like a crack in old masonry, splitting and groaning until the whole structure feels ready to collapse. Parchment suggests that the brotherhood had discovered, or conjured, a presence that demanded no outward worship, no hymns, no sacrifices of coin or flesh. What it demanded was worse. Patience, silence, a willingness to let oneself dissolve into stillness until one no longer knew where one body ended and another began. The hook of Elias' words is that they never stray into the supernatural with clarity. He never calls it a demon, nor a spirit, nor an angel fallen. He calls it the hollow, and insists it was always there, waiting beneath the stones. The priory at Kirkstead was never among the great houses of the realm. Its stones were quarried without ornament, its towers squat, its windows narrow as slits in a fortress wall. Founded in the 12th century by a band of Cistercian reformers, it had been intended not as a beacon of majesty but as a retreat, a place where silence itself might be cultivated like a crop. Its land was meager, fields of barley and rye, a low pasture where sheep huddled in the mist, and a cold brook that seldom yielded more than a few trout. To outsiders, the priory seemed plain, almost poor, yet it endured through centuries of upheaval, untouched by reform, war, or famine. For generations, its brothers prayed, labored, and died beneath the same gray stones, as if time itself were held in suspension around those cloisters. By the mid-18th century, the priory was an anachronism. Across England, the older monasteries had been stripped or abandoned, relics sold, land seized, bells melted down. But Kirkstead lingered, too small to attract the notice of kings, too remote to tempt plunderers. Its reputation among the villages nearby was of a place where the seasons never fully turned. Farmers whispered that the frost lingered longer on its fields, that lambs sickened near its pastures, that the sun dipped behind its walls too early, as though the priory itself cast a shadow heavier than stone could bear. Yet the brothers remained, and if they heard these whispers, they gave no sign. Brother Elias had not been born to Kirkstead. He was the youngest son of a Yorkshire weaver, sent to the priory in 1721 when he was no more than 12. His family could not afford to feed him, and the monastery promised discipline, prayer, and a kind of life that would at least preserve him from hunger. He entered as a novice, thin as a reed, with eyes that darted at every sound. In his confession, he describes his first nights there with a mixture of awe and unease. The silence of the place was heavier than he had ever known. Brothers spoke little, their chants brief, their movements measured. Even at meals, words were scarce. He felt that he had stepped into a world not merely apart from the village, but from time itself. Elias proved dutiful, but never entirely at peace. He records in those early pages that sleep came hard to him within the stone dormitory. The breath of the other brothers, wheezing, muttering, sighing, became oppressive, and he woke often in darkness. More troubling still were the sounds he claimed to hear beneath the floor. Not rats, not the ordinary scurry of vermin, but something slower, heavier, like the drag of cloth or the shuffle of feet. At first he thought it the workings of his young imagination, but over the years the sound did not fade. It became instead a companion to his wakefulness, as though the priory itself were restless at night. What is most unsettling is that others seemed to share his awareness, though none admitted it directly. He recalls a winter in 1728, when one of the older brothers, a man named Simon, collapsed during the morning litany. His face was gray, his mouth twisted, and when the other monks lifted him, he whispered a single phrase before dying. The words were not recorded in Latin or in any tongue Elias recognized, but he remembered the sound of them all his life. A slow, rolling syllable, guttural and wet, as if pulled from the throat rather than spoken by the tongue. No one repeated it. The prior ordered silence, and Simon was buried in haste, without the usual chant. Elias never forgot the look in the eyes of the other monks as they lowered the body into the frozen ground. Not grief, but something like relief, mingled with dread. Over time, the priory acquired a pattern of small vanishings. These were not formal disappearances, not scandals that reached the ears of bishops or sheriffs, but quiet erasures. A novice would arrive from a distant village, serve for a few months or years, and then cease to be seen. The explanation was always given in soft tones. He had been sent to another house, or he had left in weakness, or he had fallen ill and been carried home. Yet no letters came from these absent brothers, and no villagers ever saw them return. Elias himself began to note these vanishings in his journal long before the Great Confession was written. He counted 9 names over 2 decades, men who had walked the cloisters with him, who had broken bread at his side, and then simply gone. Rumors in the surrounding villages deepened with each generation. Some said the priory brewed a wine that never soured, though no vineyard grew within 100 miles. Others whispered that their bread was always warm, though no baker's fire was seen smoking from their ovens. The fields, though narrow, yielded barley even in the hardest winters, yet the livestock often bore strange deformities. Lambs with fused jaws, calves with pale eyes that rolled in their sockets. The villagers avoided the priory grounds after dusk, claiming that voices carried from the walls even when no chant was scheduled, low mutters in the night air like bees swarming. Still, no hand moved against Kirkstead. Brothers paid their dues, their land was meager, and no scandal had yet been proven. The silence of the priory was both shield and shroud. Elias grew into his vocation, though he never shook the unease that clung to him. He speaks in his confession of an incident in 1739, when he was tasked with cleaning the lowest cellars. There, behind stacks of disused flagstones, he found a door half sealed with mortar, the work crude and hurried. The wood of the door was blackened, as if by smoke, though no fire had ever touched those stones. Pressing his ear against it, he heard nothing, only a depth of silence that felt thicker than air. He fled before he could examine further, and when he later returned with courage renewed, the flagstones had been res-tacked neatly, as if no breach had ever been made. The prior of those years, Father Ambrose, was a man of stern countenance who seldom spoke more than a few words in any gathering. His sermons were brief, his eyes hooded, his voice toneless. Yet Elias recalls with particular unease the way Ambrose's hands would tremble when he touched the chalice at Mass. Not with age, for Ambrose was still in his prime, but as if the weight of the vessel were unbearable, as if he carried something unseen. After Ambrose's sudden death in 1742, no illness recorded, the priory entered a silence deeper still. No new novices were accepted, and the gates closed earlier each night. It was in these years, Elias insists, that the presence they would later call the Hollow began to thicken among them, coiling not in shadows or apparitions, but in the marrow of their own obedience. Villagers noted that after Ambrose's burial, priory bells ceased to toll. Not for feast days, not for funerals, not for matins or lauds. The tower stood mute, and when questioned, brothers replied only that the rope had rotted and must not be touched until repaired. Yet no repair was ever made. Bells hung in silence, green with corrosion, swaying only in the high winds that tore across the moor. And in that silence, some claimed they heard a deeper resonance, not the toll of bronze, but a hum that rose from the earth itself, so low it was felt in the bones rather than heard with the ears. It is here that Elias' confession darkens, for he admits that by 1744, he no longer questioned the vanishings, nor the silences, nor the strange weight that pressed upon the priory. He had grown used to it, accustomed as one becomes to a lameness or a scar. The Hollow had entered into the rhythm of his life, as steady as breath, as inevitable as dusk. He writes with shame that he did not resist, but yielded, not from devotion, but from weariness. And it was in this yielding that the true descent began. The year 1744 was remembered by the villages of Lincolnshire as one of bitter storms and failed harvests. Yet within the walls of Kirkstead Priory, the famine did not touch them. Their stores remained filled, their bread unspoiled, their broth plentiful. This in itself raised suspicion, though no man dared speak it aloud to the brothers' faces. They were regarded with wary courtesy, for while the villagers muttered of unnatural provision, they also feared offending men of God. But Elias, within the cloisters, knew that the meals set before them had changed. Bread, though warm, grew dense and heavy, with a faint aftertaste of ash. Broth, steaming in its wooden bowls, carried a scent of iron beneath the barley and lentil. At first he thought it his imagination, the consequence of unease. Yet with each meal the flavor grew more pronounced. He described one evening in particular, during Lent, when the broth arrived at table darker than he had ever seen. By the light of tallow, it shimmered thick and black, and when he raised it to his mouth, the spoon seemed to tremble of its own accord. He tasted nothing but coldness, a texture without nourishment, like swallowing oil that left the throat slick. He looked upon the faces of his brethren and saw no alarm. They ate with the same solemn slowness as always, their eyes downcast, their lips moving in what might have been prayer or in what might have been nothing at all. None spoke of the change, and Elias, though revolted, forced himself to continue. By the second spoonful, his stomach ceased its protest, and by the third, a strange calm spread through his limbs. It was not satisfaction, but something heavier, like a weight pressing upon him from within. After that night, Elias began to dread the refectory. The silence of those meals thickened until it became unbearable. He describes the scrape of spoons as deafening, the sound of swallowing like the lapping of beasts at a trough. Yet no one faltered, and no one broke the silence with jest or psalm. Even his own revulsion dulled, replaced by a kind of numb acceptance. He could no longer recall the taste of ordinary barley broth. His tongue knew only the iron and the ash. Soon after, he noticed changes in his brothers. They moved more slowly, as if their limbs had grown heavy. Their eyes lingered too long when meeting his, as though searching for recognition but finding none. At night, in the dormitory, he heard them murmur in their sleep, low sounds that were not words but resembled the guttural syllable Simon had uttered before his death years earlier. The cadence was uneven, like a chant broken apart, and it spread from one cot to another, so that sometimes the entire dormitory hummed with the sound. Elias would lie rigid, hands clutched together, waiting for silence to return. The murmurs always lasted until the first hint of dawn. Priory's library, too, began to shift. Elias remembered the texts as meager psalters, sermons, a few chronicles of saints. Yet when he returned to the shelves in those months, he found volumes he did not recall ever seeing. Their bindings were crude, their pages stained, their script faded almost to invisibility. One such book he dared to open contained nothing but blank leaves, save for a faint watermark that spread like veins across the parchment. Another bore only a single sentence written over and over, in lines that wavered and trembled, as though inscribed by a dying hand. Hollow waits, hollow waits. He replaced them quickly, yet when he looked again days later, the books were gone. The problem, as he names it, was not only in the food, nor the library, nor the murmurs. It was in the very stone. Elias recalls walking the cloister one evening, when he noticed that the arcades stretched farther than they should. What had always been 7 arches seemed now to be 9, then 10, their shadows pooling deeper and deeper. The air grew colder as he walked, and the sound of his own footsteps dulled, as though the stone absorbed rather than echoed them. When he turned back in alarm, the way to the chapel seemed longer than it had been, the arches unfamiliar. Only by clutching the beads at his side and muttering a prayer was he able to return. Yet when he did, the cloister was once again its ordinary length. None of his brothers acknowledged any change. One night, he entered the chapel after matins and found the altar cloth damp to the touch, though no rain had entered. It smelled of mildew and iron. The candles, though unlit, smoldered faintly, wicks glowing with a dull red as if they had been recently snuffed, though he had seen no flame. Upon the stone floor before the altar, he noticed faint streaks, darker than shadow, that spread outward like fingers. He stooped to touch them, and his hand came away wet. The stain glistened briefly before fading, leaving his skin cold and dry, as though nothing had been there. The problem grew harder to ignore when the brothers ceased to bury their dead. Brother Matthew, stricken with fever, died in his cot one morning. His body was carried not to the churchyard but to the cellar. Elias followed the procession, his curiosity stronger than fear. The air grew damp as they descended, the torches casting unsteady light. At the far wall, where once there had been stacked flagstones, now there was only an opening, a black passage yawning into the earth. Without word or prayer, brothers carried Matthew into that dark, their feet echoing upon unseen stone, and returned empty-handed. The opening was not sealed. Elias saw it gape each time he was sent to the cellars, though he dared not approach. From within, he felt no draught, no sound, only a depth of silence so complete that it seemed to draw his own breath toward it. It was from this moment, he wrote, that the priory ceased to belong to men. It became instead a vessel of waiting, its chambers altered, its air thick with a weight unnamed. The problem was not one of discipline, nor of heresy, nor of flesh. It was of place. The priory itself had shifted into something other than stone, and the brothers within were no longer entirely their own. The descent did not arrive with thunder or with sudden violence. It crept, quiet as mold spreading across a damp wall, until every surface, every breath, every thought was touched by it. Elias wrote that the days seemed shorter, the nights unending. When the sun did rise, its light fell pale upon the cloisters, as though filtered through water, never warming the stone. The brothers' shadows lengthened strangely, bending not with the angle of the light but as if pulled by some hidden tide beneath the earth. At first Elias believed it the trick of a weary mind, but when he sought to measure the angle of the shadows, the chalk mark upon the wall shifted each day, as though the stone itself refused to keep his witness. The silence of the priory grew heavier still. There were mornings when the bells should have called them to matins, yet no sound stirred. Brothers rose regardless, moving as one, their eyes unblinking, their lips closed tight. They chanted only rarely, and when they did, the tones fell dissonant, each voice just a note apart from harmony, creating not song but a low drone that set Elias' teeth on edge. He tried to match them, to blend, but found himself unable. His own chant wavered, caught between their tones and his own memory of the psalm. When they turned their heads toward him, he faltered and fell silent, and the drone continued without him, endless, unbroken. The refectory became a chamber of dread. Elias noted how the bowls now came without steam, though they were served as if hot. Bread was dense, its crust hard, its center damp. He chewed until his jaw ached, yet never felt sated. Still, he forced himself to eat, for hunger gnawed at him constantly. Others consumed their portions with slow precision, their faces blank, their eyes fixed not upon the food but upon the far wall. The sound of their chewing filled the hall, wet and rhythmic, until Elias nearly cried out. Yet his own chewing joined theirs, unwilling, inevitable. It was in these meals that he noticed the first vanishings within the priory itself. A brother would be present one night, his place filled, his bowl lifted to his lips. Next night his stool stood empty. No explanation was given, no word spoken. His name was not uttered, not in chant, not in passing. It was as though he had never existed. Elias at first thought he dreamed it, but as the absences grew, he began to count them in secret. Within a month, 5 had vanished. Their cots remained in the dormitory, neatly arranged, blankets folded. Their absence pressed upon the air more than their presence ever had. The cellar became a place Elias dreaded most. Tasks sent him there often, to fetch wine, to bring up sacks of barley. Each time he descended, he felt the breath of that open passage upon him, though no air stirred. The torch in his hand would gutter, not with wind but as though smothered by unseen hands. The black mouth of the passage widened with each visit. He could not be sure, but he swore it was larger than before, as if the earth itself yielded more of its depth. And from within, at times, he felt not sound but vibration, low, steady, like the thrum of a distant drum buried beneath miles of stone. One evening, curiosity overcame him. He pressed closer, torch in hand, until the light reached but a few paces into the dark. The walls were rough, cut not by mason but by something more crude, as if torn open. The floor sloped downward, and far below, he thought he saw a glimmer. Not fire, not reflection, but a wet gleam like stone sweating. He could not force himself further. His knees gave way, and he retreated in haste, the torch nearly extinguished in his grip. He told no one of what he had seen, though he suspected others had walked farther. Their eyes at table seemed deeper, their silences heavier, as though they had tasted what lay beyond. The library, too, betrayed him. Books he once trusted shifted upon the shelves. Margins that had been blank now bore faint scrawls, written in a hand he recognized as his own, though he swore he had never made them. Notes were simple phrases, repeated endlessly. Do not resist, descend, silence is the psalm. He tore one page in panic, yet when he returned days later, the book was whole again, the phrases rewritten. His own hand began to shake when he lifted a quill, for he feared what words might emerge without his will. The descent of his brethren deepened as well. Their faces grew gaunt, their eyes sunk, their lips cracked and pale, yet their movements slowed, as though their bodies bore no weight at all. They drifted through the cloisters like shades, their feet scarcely touching stone. At night, Elias woke to find one of them standing by his cot, unmoving, eyes fixed upon him. He dared not stir. Only after what felt like hours did the figure turn and slip silently back into the dark. This happened not once, but many nights, each with a different brother. None spoke of it in daylight. The last clear sign came in the chapel. Elias entered alone, seeking refuge, and found the altar bare. The chalice was gone, the cloth stripped away. In its place lay a single stone, round and smooth, wet with condensation though the air was dry. He touched it, and his hand grew cold to the bone. He tried to lift it, but it adhered to the altar as if part of it. When he stepped back, he noticed faint grooves in the stone floor, radiating outward like lines of a labyrinth, converging at the altar's base. They were shallow, yet unmistakable, and when he traced them with his finger, he felt a pulse, faint as a heartbeat, thrumming in the stone. From that moment, Elias knew the priory was no longer a house of prayer. It was a vessel for something older, heavier, nameless, and the descent had only begun. Elias wrote that there comes a point when fear ceases to quicken the heart and instead stills it, when terror becomes less a fire than an ice, numbing, unyielding. By 1745, the priory had entered that frozen state. Brothers no longer spoke save for the broken chants, their voices a droning hum that never lifted into true psalm. Bells had long fallen silent, gardens lay untended, and the sheep in the lower pasture had vanished, their pen left open to the wind. No villager approached the gates. Elias sometimes wondered if the world beyond had ceased altogether, if fields, roads, and cottages had been swallowed by the same darkness that seeped from the cellar mouth. Vanishings grew more brazen. He recalled one evening at table when a brother seated beside him laid down his spoon, folded his hands, and closed his eyes. The others continued eating in silence. When Elias turned back moments later, the stool was empty. No one acknowledged it. The bowl remained half-filled, steamless, the spoon resting across its rim. Elias touched it in disbelief. It was cold, as though hours had passed. When he glanced upward, he found the faces of his brethren fixed upon him, their eyes glassy and void. He forced himself to lower his gaze, to resume eating, though every swallow felt like swallowing the void itself. The cellar grew restless. Each errand into its depths carried him nearer to the passage, though he swore he tried to resist. His feet turned toward it unbidden, his torch guttering each time. He began to hear, not only the low vibration, but voices mingled within it. Not words, but the shape of words, syllables that tugged at memory. Sometimes they echoed in the tones of his brethren, sometimes in voices he remembered from childhood. He pressed his hands to his ears, yet the sound grew louder, spreading not through the air but through the stone, through his bones, until his very teeth seemed to hum with it. At last, compelled by a will not his own, Elias stepped across the threshold. The descent into that passage he described as walking into breathless water. His torchlight clung feebly to the walls, revealing surfaces not cut by man but worn smooth, damp and slick. The air pressed against him, heavy, saturated with a mineral tang like rusted iron. He descended slowly, each step carrying him deeper into silence, until the vibration became a steady thrum in his chest. He does not say how long he walked. Time seemed to collapse, each moment identical, until he reached a chamber that widened without warning. There he saw his brothers. They stood in a ring, their heads bowed, their hands clasped loosely before them. At their feet lay the missing brethren, or what remained of them. Bodies pale and slack, not wounded, not decayed, but emptied, their eyes sunken, their mouths slightly open as though caught mid-breath. No chant filled the chamber, yet the hum of the earth reverberated more strongly than ever, a presence that seemed to rise from the very stone. Elias' torch flickered wildly, and in its flare he glimpsed the center of the ring. He did not name what he saw. His words falter, the ink trembling, lines blotched by sweat or tears. He described only a surface that was not surface, a depth that was not depth, a darkness so complete that it seemed to devour the torchlight. Brothers stood around it in rapture, swaying gently, their eyes closed, their lips parting in silence. Elias felt himself drawn forward, his knees weakening, his own breath aligning with the rhythm of the hum. He nearly stepped into the ring when his torch at last extinguished, plunging him into total blackness. He fled. He does not remember how, only that he stumbled back into the cellar proper, scraping his hands against the walls, lungs heaving with air that felt suddenly sharp and thin. When he reached the cloister, dawn had already broken, yet the priory remained dark, its stones drinking the light. His brothers walked as usual, silent, unhurried, as though nothing had occurred. Yet Elias knew. They had descended beyond prayer, beyond humanity. The priory itself was an altar, its stones arranged not for God but for the hollow. From that day forward, Elias lived in constant dread. He no longer slept but dozed fitfully, waking to find figures at his cot, their breath shallow, their eyes open. He no longer ate without nausea, forcing each bite past a throat that wished to close. He no longer prayed with conviction, for the psalms caught in his mouth, their words fragile against the weight pressing upon him. He carried within him the certainty that the priory had crossed into something irreversible, that its silence was no longer chosen but imposed, and that each breath he drew brought him closer to the fate of those slack bodies in the chamber below. Horror was not in the sight of death, nor in the fear of pain. It was in the recognition that the brothers had surrendered willingly, their faces serene as they stood in worship of nothingness, their devotion turned inward to a void that gave nothing, promised nothing, yet held them more tightly than any creed. Elias could not decide if they were mad or if he had seen truth or delusion. The ink of his confession darkens here, words pressed deep into the parchment. They gave themselves to silence, and the silence answered. The hollow sings. The days following Elias' descent into the cellar stretched thin, each one a repetition of the last, yet each bearing the weight of inevitability. He knew the priory was emptying, though the dormitory still seemed full by night and the cloister still paced by robed figures at day. Vanishings came faster now. A brother would kneel beside him in prayer one evening, his lips moving in that soundless chant, and by dawn his cot would stand empty. No explanation was offered, no glance exchanged, no grief acknowledged. The absences became more numerous than the presences, until Elias found himself surrounded not by companions but by shades. The food ceased altogether. Bowls were laid before them, but no steam rose, no scent carried. Bread was black, broth a colorless slurry. Elias forced himself to swallow, but his stomach clenched in revolt. The others ate without pause, spoon to lips, lips to spoon, as though consuming not matter but ritual itself. He grew weak, his hands trembling, his knees buckling beneath him. Yet no one seemed to notice, or if they did, their eyes offered no recognition, no mercy. The chance changed. Where once the low drone had filled the chapel, now silence prevailed even there. Brothers gathered, heads bowed, mouths unmoving. Yet Elias swore he heard it still, not in their voices, but in the stone. The walls themselves seemed to hum, faint but insistent, vibrating against his skull. He pressed his hands to his ears. The sound remained, rising and falling like the breath of the earth. It followed him into the cloister, into the dormitory, into his very sleep. He began to dream of corridors stretching endlessly, arches repeating without end, and beneath each arch the same figure waiting, faceless, robed, unmoving. When he woke, sweat drenched his body, and still the hum persisted. At last, one night, he rose from his cot and walked the cloister alone. The moon hung pale above, yet its light failed to pierce the arches. Each step echoed as though upon hollow stone. He turned toward the chapel and found the doors ajar. Inside, no candles burned, no altar stood. The chamber was bare, emptied of all but shadow. In the center, upon the flagstones, lay the same smooth stone he had touched before. Only now it was larger, rounder, its surface slick with condensation. Grooves in the floor had deepened, their lines more pronounced, radiating outward like veins. And when he bent close, he heard not only the hum, but whispers seeping from the stone itself. He could not make out the words, but he knew the voices. They were his brothers, those vanished, those still present, those long buried. Their tones mingled, rising and falling, a chorus without melody, without pause. The stone pulsed faintly, and Elias felt his own breath fall in rhythm with it. He staggered backward, yet his body longed to kneel, to press his face to the damp surface, to surrender. With all the strength he possessed, he fled into the cloister, his heartbeat pounding louder than the hum, though not loud enough to drown it. By dawn, the priory was empty. He walked the dormitory, the refectory, the cloister, and found no one. Cots were neatly arranged, bowls set upon the tables, doors closed in order. Yet no footsteps echoed, no voices stirred. He descended to the cellar, torch in hand, and found the passage yawning wider than before. The air that rose from it was heavy, wet, and warm, like the breath of a cavernous lung. He dared not step across the threshold. He knew, without seeing, that his brothers had gone there, one by one, swallowed by the hollow. Elias returned to the chapel, to the stone that now glistened in the half-light. He knew he could not remain, yet he could not leave either. He wrote that his knees gave way before it, and for hours he lay prostrate, cold damp seeping into his bones. The whispers grew clearer, pressing against his skull, urging him to join, to descend, to be silent. He clenched his hands until the nails broke his palms, yet still the urge swelled. Only the thought of his own name, fragile and fading, kept him from yielding. He fled the priory at last, though he does not remember how. His next clear memory is of wandering the moors, robes torn, lips cracked, eyes blinded by sunlight that felt alien upon his skin. He carried with him the parchment, the ink, the will to confess. He wrote that his words were not for absolution, for he knew none awaited him, but for warning. He claimed the priory still stood, its stones silent, its cloisters empty, yet within its cellars the hollow waits still. Brothers had not died, nor departed. They had entered into silence, and silence had received them. The final lines of his confession are barely legible. The ink smeared, the letters broken. He wrote only, "I hear them still. Beneath the stone, beneath the soil, beneath the marrow. The hollow waits, the hollow sings, and I am not free." With that, the manuscript ends. No date of his death is recorded. No burial place is known. Only the priory's ruin remains, its stones open to wind and rain, its cellars sealed once more by earth and time. Yet those who uncovered his confession swore that the air of the chamber where it was found still carried that hum, faint, steady, inescapable, as if the silence of Kirkstead had never ended, only spread outward, waiting for ears willing to listen. The antiquarian's folly. Nearly a century passed before Kirkstead was spoken of again. By the early decades of the 19th century, the priory had fallen into obscurity, its stones reduced to little more than a weathered mound upon the moor. Shepherds passed without remark, villagers avoided it instinctively, and maps recorded only a faint mark where once cloisters had stood. Yet in 1823, a party of antiquarians from Lincoln arrived with the intention of surveying medieval foundations across the countryside. Their journals, preserved in fragments, mark the first mention of the priory since the era of Elias' confession. Men wrote of a curious silence upon the approach. Though skylarks and curlews filled the heathered moor, their calls fell away as the party neared the low ridge. The ground underfoot grew sodden, though no rain had fallen, and the air hung cool and damp as though exhaled from some cavernous depth. They found, neath moss and gorse, a faint outline of stone footings, a rectangular pattern suggesting a cloister. Digging with care, they uncovered sections of wall, a portion of arch, and, beneath layers of peat, the flagstones of what they believed to be the chapel floor. It was here, amid the uneven flagging, that one of the men struck upon an object of singular nature. A stone, smooth and circular, its surface unlike the weathered masonry surrounding it. At first glance it seemed a millstone, yet without hole or groove. Its color was darker, its weight disproportionate, and when struck with iron it yielded not the clear ring of quarried stone but a dull, throbbing note, as though something within absorbed the blow. Men, curious but untroubled, recorded the find and pressed on. Yet their journals grew stranger. One entry mentions that upon lifting the stone they discovered beneath it a cavity, descending into earth. The air that rose was cool and moist, bearing a mineral tang. They lowered a lantern, but its flame dimmed at once, guttering though no wind stirred. Few of the party urged descent, yet none found courage. The journal breaks here, its lines smudged, its ink blurred as though written with a trembling hand. When it resumes, it is only to state that the stone was replaced, the cavity sealed once more. Thereafter, the men reported disturbances among themselves. One complained of a persistent ringing in his ears, another of whispers intruding upon sleep. Several recorded dreams of cloisters without end, arches stretching into blackness, and the sensation of being watched by figures unseen. None confessed these things aloud at the time, but their surviving papers, compared later, reveal uncanny similarity in detail. Within a fortnight of their visit, 2 had died, one by fever, the other by drowning in the Witham. Survivors never returned to the site. For decades after, Kirkstead was left undisturbed. The moor reclaimed its ruins, the stone outlines sinking once more beneath heather and sod. Yet stories spread quietly among villagers, of lights upon the ridge, of a humming herd on still nights, of livestock found straying near the mound with eyes clouded and limbs trembling. Children were warned away, travelers given detours, and the name Kirkstead spoken rarely, and then with unease. But the stone remained. It waited, sealed beneath turf and time, its hum faint but unbroken, its whispers rising only for those willing to stoop close enough to hear. The shepherd of the ridge. By the closing years of the century, Kirkstead was little more than a place of avoidance, a nameless mound upon the moor. Yet avoidance has its limits, and necessity its demands. In 1887, a shepherd named Matthew Willoughby drove his flock across that ridge in search of fresh grazing. Summer had been dry, the lower fields withered, and the moor, though poor, promised some respite. He was a man of quiet temperament, hardened by wind and solitude, yet even he hesitated when his dog balked, whining at the slope. Still, hunger presses harder than fear, and he led the sheep up, their bells chiming uneasily in the hush. He later told his wife that the air upon the ridge was wrong. It was not the stillness of a summer's day, nor the chill of autumn, but something heavier, more deliberate. Each breath felt weighed, as though drawn not from sky but from stone. The sheep grew restless, their bleating sharp, their hooves clattering against stone half buried beneath the grass. When he stooped to clear the moss, Matthew uncovered a line of flagstones, pale and damp, slick though the sky was dry. He followed their course until they led him to a depression at the hill's center, where the ground dipped subtly and the air smelled of earth newly turned. There, just visible through heather and turf, lay the smooth curve of a stone unlike the rest. He knew at once it was not meant to be walked upon. Something in its polish, its seamless surface, resisted the notion of accident. Yet he placed his hand upon it all the same. He swore it was warm, faintly, like the side of a beast at rest. At his touch, the sheep startled as one, bolting down the slope, their bells jangling in chaos. His dog tore after them, and in moments the ridge was empty. Matthew stood alone upon the stone, his breath shallow, his palm damp though the air was dry. He withdrew at last, shaken, and herded his flock home with difficulty. At night he slept uneasily, dreams heavy with corridors of dripping stone. His name whispered from shadows just beyond the lantern's reach. In the weeks that followed, Matthew changed. His wife noted his silence at table, his long absences in the fields even after the sheep were folded. He took to walking the ridge alone, sometimes returning near dawn, his clothes damp as if from mist though the nights had been clear. He grew thin, his cheeks hollow, his eyes ringed dark. The children avoided him, frightened by his muttering, by the way he would pause in the doorway and stare as though listening to something far beyond the room. One evening he did not return. His dog came back at dusk, tail low, paws caked in mud. Matthew was not with him. The search party crossed the moor, lanterns bobbing in the dark, calling his name. They found no body, no sign of struggle, only the ridge itself, bare and silent. Yet those who ventured nearest swore they heard something beneath the soil, a faint vibration, steady as breath, rising through the soles of their boots. None lingered long. The search was abandoned by dawn, and his wife wore widow's black before autumn set in. Stories do not end so cleanly. For months after, villagers claimed to see Matthew at a distance, wandering the ridge at twilight, his figure stooped, his gait slow, his head bent as though in prayer. No dog accompanied him, no flock followed, and when called to he did not turn. Those who dared approach found nothing but empty heather. His wife forbade her children to speak his name aloud. Yet they swore they still heard his tread upon the threshold at night, the faint rasp of boots across stone, and the low hum of a voice that did not form words but lingered in the silence between them. Spreading silence. In the months that followed Matthew Willoughby's vanishing, the ridge ceased to be merely a barren rise of ground. It became, once more, a place whispered of in caution, a boundary across which few would step. Children were warned sternly to keep clear, not only for fear of bog or snake, but because their mothers confessed to a deeper unease. Men driving carts along the lower track swore their horses balked without reason, stamping and rolling their eyes as they neared the slope, refusing the road until forced by whip and curse. Shepherds began to notice their flocks grazing in a wide crescent around the hill, leaving its crown untouched, though the grass there grew thicker and greener than elsewhere. Matthew's widow, Ruth, endured the months with a grim silence of her own. Neighbors brought bread, lent hands with the sheep, and spoke kindly at her door, yet all remarked upon the house's strange stillness. Even the children seemed subdued, their play muted, their laughter clipped short. Ruth herself grew pale, her hair streaked with gray though she was yet young. On more than one occasion she was seen standing motionless in her doorway at dusk, her eyes fixed upon the ridge. When spoken to she gave no answer, but only turned slowly back inside, closing the door without sound. Soon after, others in the village began to dream. They spoke of long corridors, of dripping stone walls, of voices echoing faintly but never drawing near. Some saw Matthew among the shadows, his face pale, his mouth moving without sound. Others woke with the impression of a pressure upon their chests, as if something vast and unseen leaned close to listen. These dreams spread quietly, never spoken of too loudly, for fear of contagion in the telling. Yet by winter, nearly every household confessed to some visitation of the sort. The parish vicar, troubled by the unrest, preached sternly against superstition. He warned that grief, left unchecked, breeds visions, and that the mind, burdened by hunger and toil, may conjure phantoms from shadows. Yet he, too, was heard pacing his study at night, his candle flickering in the rectory window until dawn. His sermons grew halting, his voice breaking as though his breath faltered mid-sentence. By Advent, he no longer rang the chapel bell himself, and the sound of its iron tongue was heard less and less, until silence replaced it entirely. What unsettled the village most were the sounds upon the moor. At first faint, they came on still nights when the wind lay low and the stars burned cold. A hum, steady, low, almost too deep for the ear, seemed to rise from the ground itself. Dogs cowered, cattle pressed against their stalls, and men lying wakeful in bed felt the vibration in their bones, as though the earth itself murmured beneath them. Once, a child wandering too near the ridge returned pale and mute, refusing to speak for days. When at last his tongue loosened, he whispered only, "He is praying there still," and would say no more. By spring, Ruth and her children were gone. No word of departure, no farewell left behind. Their cottage stood open, its hearth cold, its few possessions scattered but not plundered. Neighbors entered cautiously, finding no sign of struggle, no trace of hurried flight. Beds were neatly made, the table cleared, the door left upon its latch. Only a faint dampness lingered in the air, a mineral tang that clung to stone and timber alike. Some claimed to hear footsteps in the upper room, though none were seen. The house was left to ruin, its thatch sagging, its walls weathering into the soil. The village never spoke of Ruth again. Yet on certain evenings, when the wind died and the moon hung thin, figures were seen moving upon the ridge. Not many, but one or two, stooped and slow, their heads bent as if listening to the ground. No one approached to learn if they were real. To look too long was to feel the hum in one's teeth, to hear faint syllables at the edge of thought, to risk knowing. And so the ridge was given wide berth, its silence left to deepen, its stone left to breathe unseen. Scholar's ledger. By the turn of the 20th century, the moors of Lincolnshire were no longer untouched expanses. Rail lines cut across heath and fen, new roads linked distant towns, and antiquarians with shovels and notebooks spread like restless crows across the countryside. It was in 1909 that Kirkstead's Ridge again drew official notice, this time from the county's historical society. Its mound was marked upon an old survey, annotated faintly with the word priory, and a proposal was made to excavate in the summer months. The men who came to dig were not the cloaked figures of the past, but suited scholars and laborers with spades, wheelbarrows, and brass compasses. Yet even they remarked, in letters preserved in the Society's archive, that the air upon the ridge was peculiar. One wrote that the ground seemed to quiver faintly beneath the boots, as though hollowed within. Another complained that his sleep in the nearby inn was troubled by a drone without source, like bees sealed in the marrow of one's bones. Yet no one confessed such things aloud in daylight. They laughed instead, and pressed on with their work. Within days, the outlines of the priory emerged, the cloister's arch, the refectory wall, the crumbled stair descending into earth. Men were jubilant, noting the preservation of the stone and the clarity of the foundation's plan. But as spades cut deeper, they reached a floor of flagstone, damp and cold though the summer air was dry. At its center lay the same smooth stone described a century before, half-buried, round, its surface dark and seamless. Photographs were taken, dim, grainy plates that show little more than a circle in shadow. Notes beside them remark upon its extraordinary weight, its resistance to chisel or hammer, and its peculiar tendency to draw moisture upon even the hottest days. On the third week, laborers attempted to raise it. With iron levers and ropes they strained, yet the stone shifted hardly an inch. When at last it lifted, even briefly, a current of cold air surged upward, damp and metallic, as though exhaled from a cavern. The lanterns held above the cavity dimmed at once, their flames bowing low though no wind stirred. One man swore he heard voices rising from below, faint and layered, though his companions dismissed it as echo. Still no one descended. The stone was allowed to settle back into place, with a final thud that reverberated through soil and bone alike. The journals grew more erratic thereafter. Several men recorded sleeplessness, dreams of corridors dripping with moisture, arches without end, and figures waiting silently in the dark. One scholar wrote of hearing his own name whispered as he bent over his notes, though no one stood near. Another described the sense of being watched from the pit, though he knew it lay sealed. Accidents multiplied. Tools slipped, ropes frayed, carts overturned. By the fourth week, the excavation was abandoned, the trench half filled, the site left once more to moss and heather. Yet those who lived nearby remembered. Farmers swore the hum grew louder after the dig, carrying on still nights like the toll of a distant bell. Shepherds claimed their flocks avoided the ridge entirely, circling wide though the grass was richest there. Children dared each other to climb the mound, returning pale and wordless, their laughter broken. And in the village, an old story stirred again, the tale of the priory's last brother, who fled with words of warning, who wrote that silence itself had opened beneath the stone. By 1911, the county society no longer spoke of Kirkstead. Photographs were filed away, the journals stored in drawers. Yet one letter survives, written by the youngest of the surveyors to his wife. Its ink is faded, the lines uneven, as though written with a trembling hand. It ends with these words, *, we have not dug into earth, but into breath. Stone covers not soil, but a mouth. And though we have closed it, I fear it does not close us out. It waits, calls. Even now I hear it, beneath the turning of the world. Mouth. In the autumn of 1916, the moors of Lincolnshire bore witness to a strange intrusion. The war on the continent had drained towns of their sons, and the countryside bristled with temporary camps, barracks, and hospitals. Kirkstead's Ridge, remote yet accessible by track, was chosen as a billet for a small detachment of soldiers returned from France to recover strength before reassignment. They erected canvas tents on the lower slope, drove iron pegs into soil long unbroken, and set about their routines with the clatter of boots and shouted orders. At first the men remarked only upon the quiet. No guns thundered, no shells shrieked overhead, only the call of curlew across the heather. Yet at night the silence weighed heavy. Accustomed to the roar of bombardment, the soldiers found the absence unnerving, as though some vast ear pressed against the earth, waiting. More than one man confessed, in letters home, that he slept poorly, his dreams full of corridors without end, of stone arches dripping with moisture, of companions lost just beyond sight. They woke with hearts hammering, breath sharp, though no sound disturbed the camp but the low sigh of wind. It was during these weeks that the stone was uncovered once more. Soldiers, restless, dug fire pits and trenches for latrines, their spades striking against flagging beneath the turf. They uncovered a portion of the priory's foundation, half collapsed, the outlines of a chamber whose air was cooler than the moor above. The officers ordered it left alone, wary of collapse, but curiosity is stronger than command. Several men returned by lantern light, prying loose stones, widening the gap until the chamber opened like a dark mouth. Within, the ground sloped downward, damp and glistening, toward a circle of smooth stone half revealed in shadow. They did not dare move it, yet they lingered. One wrote later that standing before it was like standing before the door of a dugout already occupied, hearing the breath of those within though no light showed. Another swore he heard a murmur, faint as distant artillery, though no battle raged in that quarter. Men retreated uneasily, but from then on none wished to pitch their tents near the opening. By day they avoided the subject, yet at night they glanced often toward the ridge, where no sound should have come but where silence seemed to thicken, a silence not empty but listening. Then came the vanishings. First a private, last seen walking toward the latrine after dark. Then another, his bedroll empty at dawn. No trace was found, no struggle marked the ground, no cry had been heard. The officers searched the moor, lanterns bobbing in the mist, but the ridge gave nothing. The reports were filed as desertion, though none believed it. The missing men had left their pay, their letters, their boots. Only their absence remained, and the faint hum in the soil beneath the canvas floor. Within weeks, the detachment was reassigned. Camp was struck, canvas packed, trenches filled hastily. The soldiers marched away, glad to leave the ridge to its silence. Yet among their ranks whispers persisted, carried across billets and trains and ships bound once more for France. Men spoke of a place where the ground breathed, where names were called in dreams, where silence pressed heavier than shellfire. No official record marked it, but in diaries and half-burned letters, Kirkstead appeared again, not as ruin, not as priory, but as mouth. The war ended, but the silence did not. Villagers claimed the ridge grew stranger in those years, its grass always damp, its air colder than the season. On winter nights, the hum was said to carry across frozen fields, steady and low, a sound that neither wind nor earth could explain. Shepherds crossed themselves and drove their flocks wide. Children dared each other to climb the slope, returning pale and trembling, their laughter muted. And when the bells of armistice rang, echoing across Faughan and Moor, those who stood near Kirkstead swore the sound was swallowed, muffled, as though the ridge itself refused to rejoice.